One on the freeze in federal funding. Who advised the president on the legality of telling government agencies that they don't have to spend money that was already appropriated by Congress?
Well, as the OMB memo states, this is certainly within the confines of the law. So White House counsel's office believes that this is within the president's power to do it, and therefore he's doing it.
Okay, so they disagree with lawmakers who say that they don't have the power to freeze this funding.
Again, I would point you to the language in the memo that clearly states this is draft without his consent.
Is on the record talking about issuing preemptive pardons to these people.
But was he aware of his signature being used on every single pardon? That's a question you should ask the Biden White House.
Is there any evidence on that?
You're a reporter, you should.
Karoline Leavitt wasn't open to Kaitlan Collins' plan when she presented it. It began when Collins posed a query that has been addressed numerous times. Collins pushed for another news statement from Leavitt, this time regarding the texts the president had examined. Leavitt quietly told Collins that this had been brought up several times previously, but he was obviously annoyed. Collins attempted to arrange for another follow-up, but Leavitt cut her off.
I have two questions. One on a follow-up on something you just said, but since we have these messages released and you said that the president has now personally reviewed them, in the chat at one point Pete Hegseth wrote 1415 strike drones on target, and in all caps he said, "This is when the first bombs will definitely drop." Does the president feel that he was misled by his national security advisors, whoever it was that told him there was no classified information in there, now that he's seen these messages? I've now been asked and answered this question 3 times by the both of you, and I've given you my answer. The president feels the same today as he did yesterday.
Okay,
so, and on my follow-up on what you had just said.
Go ahead, Phyllis. Caitlin, I'm not taking your follow-up.
In that brief time, it became evident that Collins was attempting to exert control over the room in addition to asking questions, and Leavitt was preventing her from channeling that same intensity into a more urgent problem that generated actual heat. It was rough, swift, and chilly. Collins blasted the White House for retaliating by barring an AP reporter from accessing the Oval Office for refusing to use the phrase Gulf of America rather than Gulf of Mexico.
I don't think for you, which White House official made the decision to bar the AP reporter from the Oval Office and the diplomatic reception room last night?
Well, first of all, let me just set the record straight. It is a privilege to cover this White House. It's a privilege to be the White House press secretary. And nobody has the right to go into the Oval Office and ask the President of the United States questions. That's an invitation that is given. And there are hundreds of outlets on this campus. Many of you in this room who don't have the privilege of being part of that pool every single day and getting to ask the President questions. We reserve the right to decide who gets to go into the Oval Office, and you all have credentials to be here, including the Associated Press, who is in this briefing room today.
But isn't it retaliatory in nature is the argument, because the reason that the AP was barred, which they said was because they're not using the phrase Gulf of America, they're using Gulf of Mexico in line with...
Even though questioning the president is a privilege rather than a right, Leavitt didn't raise any objections. She said the administration had the power to choose who was admitted and that many other reporters were not given the same daily access. She then resisted the media, saying that if they choose not to use the correct name, which is being used by large internet companies, it is their duty, not the administration's.
I was very upfront in my briefing on day one that if we feel that there are lies being pushed by outlets in this room, we are going to hold those lies accountable. And it is a fact that the body of water off the coast of Louisiana is called the Gulf of America. And I'm not sure why news outlets don't want to call it that, but that is what it is. The Secretary of Interior has made that the official designation in the geographical identification name server, and Apple has recognized that, Google has recognized that, pretty much every other outlet in this room has recognized that body of water as the Gulf of...
Collins persisted in pressing, asking if this was a dangerous precedent and asserting that the White House was punishing reporters who disagreed with their story. Even while Leavitt remained firm in her assertion that media organizations would be held accountable if they were spreading false information, conflict persisted. After moving to Ukraine before the next round of negotiations began, Kaitlan questioned whether the United States was ceding bargaining power. Leavitt stayed away from specifics, assuring everyone that Trump was actively participating and that senior negotiators were already in place.
Caitlin.
Thanks, Caroline. I have a few things for you, but on the commitment by President Trump, he said that he and President Putin agreed to visit each other's respective nations. Are there any preconditions that President Trump has that President Putin must do before he goes and meets with him, withdrawing some forces, withdrawing all forces, anything like that?
Not that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but I was just talking with the president in our national security team. I wasn't made aware of any conditions, but if they exist, I'm happy to provide those.
And on the president himself, he styles himself as this master negotiator. He is now deploying these negotiations, saying that they start immediately. We did hear from the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, though, today, saying that NATO membership is not realistic for Ukraine, and neither is returning to pre-2014 borders. Aren't they giving away bargaining chips before these negotiations even started?
Again, I haven't talked to the president about Ukraine's NATO membership, and he appointed several individuals to negotiate on his behalf. He's directly involved in these negotiations as well, and I'm sure if you ask him that question in the near future, when you're able to, he'll give you an answer. I just don't want.
With Collins' sharp questions and Leavitt's passionate responses, it was obvious that this would not be your usual news conference. When Biden's use of auto-open signatures for pardons was brought up, the real battle began. Collins questioned if the decision was ever legitimate and whether Trump had the authority to revoke such pardons.
Pardons that were issued by President Biden preemptively to members of the January 6th committee, that they're now null and void. Have attorneys here at the White House told President Trump that he has the legal authority to undo a pardon simply because it was signed by auto?
Leavitt immediately changed the subject by inquiring as to whether Biden was even aware of the pardons. She also questioned the president's competence and mental health, bringing up issues that had been brought up even during Biden's time in office.
The president was begging the question that I think a lot of journalists in this room should be asking about whether or not the former president of the United States, who I think we can all finally agree was cognitively impaired. I know it took people some time to finally admit that, but we all know that to be true, as evidenced by his disastrous debate performance against President Trump during the campaign. I digress on that. But the president was raising the point that did the president even know about these pardons? Was his illegal signature used without his consent?
That wasn't just a legal problem. It was a blow to the political system. Signing binding contracts without the chief executive's full authorization may cause major problems, possibly including criminal ones, Karoline said.
Knowledge. And that's not just the president or me raising those questions, Caitlin. According to the New York Post, there are Biden officials from the previous White House who raised those questions and wondered if the president was even consulted about his legally binding signature being signed onto documents. And so I think it's a question that everybody in this room should be looking into, because certainly that would propose perhaps criminal or illegal behavior if staff members were signing.
It was about the highest degree of proficiency and credibility control, not only about pardons. Although Caitlin had been silent by this point, she stood up again and returned with a fresh challenge. She brought up the fact that Trump had dismissed several inspectors general and prosecutors in the Justice Department without providing Congress with the required 30-day notice. When Trump broke the law, the administration was selectively choosing which regulations to enforce.
In the memo that clearly states this is within the law.
And all that happened on Friday night. The administration fired several inspectors general without giving Congress the 30-day legally required notification that they were being fired. I think only 2 were left at DHS and the DOJ. And then yesterday we saw several prosecutors, I believe 12, fired from the Justice Department who worked on the investigations into the president. As you know, they are career prosecutors, therefore they are afforded civil service protections. How is the
Leavitt remained unwavering once more, citing a previous Supreme Court ruling that supported their position. She claimed that Trump had every legal authority to make those choices since he was the president and the law permitted it.
wants to ignore?
So it is the belief of this White House and the White House counsel's office that the president was within his executive authority to do that. He is the executive of the executive branch, and therefore he has the power to fire anyone within the executive branch that he wishes to. There's also a case that went before the Supreme Court in 2020, Scala Law LLC versus the Customs, Bureau Protection. I would advise you to look at that case, and that's the legality.
When Collins asked if the White House was certain they would win the case, Leavitt said without hesitation, yes, absolutely they would win. Of all the moments, this one was the easiest. Leavitt claims that Trump personally ordered those dismissals. It wasn't simply any staff memo. It was a directive directly from the top.
That if they bring lawsuits against you, the prosecutors who were fired, that they will succeed.
We will win in court.
And
yes.
did he personally direct this, given they worked on the classified documents investigation and the election interference investigation?
This was a memo that went out by the Presidential Personnel Office, and the President is the leader of this White House.
Each response was instructive. Every emotion was directed towards Collins, who was employing Caitlyn as his means to exert control, but Karoline was able to channel that energy and flip it around. One thing was evident even though neither team gave up or left without any casualties.